And we'll get started. Hi, I'm Audrey Barker-Plotkin, and I'm part of the Northeast Risk Management Network. And I'm so glad that so many of you are able to come to our webinar today. We have a webinar series, so keep an eye out for upcoming talks. And when I have half a second, I will, if you aren't already on the Northeast Risk Listserv email list and would like to be, I'll put in information on how to sign up, or maybe one of my colleagues can do that if they have a sec. So it's a real pleasure to introduce my two speakers today, Tony DAmato and Amanda Mahaffey. So when we're putting our webinars together, we really want to put research and management in context with one another. So it's really great to pair these speakers up. They both do both, but primarily Tony is research and Amanda's management. Tony DAmato is a professor of silviculture and forest ecology in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And he directs the forestry program in the UVM research forests. Let's see, he got his bachelor's degree from the University of Maine, where we overlap just a little bit. He got his master's at University of Oregon, and then got his doctorate from the University of Massachusetts. And his research centers on evaluating traditional and experimental strategies to meet, all the different forest management objectives on public and private land. And Amanda Mahaffey is Deputy Director of the Forest Stewards Guild, and she develops programs that support the Guild's mission to practice and promote responsible forestry as a means of sustaining the integrity of forest ecosystems and the human communities that depend on them. She's a licensed forester, and she has degrees from Yale University and the University of Southern Maine. So Tony and Amanda have worked together quite a lot recently on research and management around an invasive forest insect, the emerald ash borer, and how to do forest management that mitigates the threat of this invasive pest. So they're going to be talking about building community to address the threat of emerald ash borer to northern forests. All right, take it away. I think Tony.
Thanks, Audrey, and thanks, folks, for logging in on what's a really nice day to be outside versus inside looking at a screen. But what we're going to do today, as Audrey mentioned, really what we were tasked with was putting together a presentation dealing with an invasive insect, but really emphasizing that partnership between managers and scientists in addressing this issue. And so I feel really spoiled that I was able to pull on the arm of an awesome manager and boundary spanner, Amanda Mahaffey, to help out with this. And really our goal today is just to highlight just some of the efforts that have been going on, both from the research perspective, certainly a broader cultural awareness perspective, and kind of development of community of practice perspective as it relates to trying to address the threat of emerald ash borer, both here in the Northeast, but also certainly speak a bit to some of the work that's been going on in other parts of the country, primarily in the lake states. So Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, hopefully that slide advanced. Yeah, just to tag on to what Tony described, all of you work with invasive species of some kind, and of all the issues that are plaguing our forests today, emerald ash borer has really had the greatest cultural impact. And so you might have heard a lot of the science before, but again, we're emphasizing the community of practice because we believe that we can find solutions to challenges such as DAB and other invasives through impacting the community of practice. Before we really dive in, we want to respectfully acknowledge that the Haudenosaunee, the Wabanaki, and many other indigenous peoples are really the original stewards of the forest that we're discussing today. Since time immemorial, they have belonged to the land where black ash is found. And we ask that you please consider this in your forest stewardship decisions today and into the future. We'll talk more about this, but it's really important to recognize the cultural importance of black ash in particular. As you can see from this, the background photo and other photos that we'll share, basket making is really an integral part of indigenous people's identity and who they are. And it's really important that as we talk about stewarding forests and making decisions about what do we do now, what do we do today, we have to recognize the history of a long, long, long tradition of management from where this came. As Audrey said, a lot of what we are doing today is really because of a scientist-manager partnership. You might have heard the term code switching. So you can speak science, you can speak manager, you can speak woodland owner, you can speak volunteer who likes to pull up Japanese knotweed. But together, we're really part of a community that's trying to steward these forests, including where EAB has had a really unfortunate impact. And building this community of practice, mixing science and management, which is where our worlds meet. And it's by working with this community that we can really change the system. What our goal is, it's not just managing the insects, but we're really looking at making the system whole again with ash as a central component of the system. Humans, as stated in the Forest Stewards Guild mission, humans are part of the ecosystem too, and you can't hope to restore ecological balance without impacting the human element in that. And as we'll talk about today, we have two kind of core areas in our presentation. We do that by building a community of knowledge and also by building a community of practice.
And so when we think about building a community of knowledge, traditionally from a Western perspective, much of what we would do is just initiate new studies and certainly spend a considerable amount of time reviewing the primary literature and what's understood about a given system. But really, the example with emerald ash borer and the threat that it poses to forest systems, and more importantly, the people that rely on those, really I think is an excellent example and probably one of the most acute examples of the value of using traditional knowledge and traditional experiences to both inform how we approach addressing a threat, but also to help guide what might be some useful Western science to affirm what already exists in terms of traditional knowledge. And so I'll go through and really talk a bit about just how we built a community of knowledge from kind of my perspective as scientist and some of the things that we do from our Western tradition, but really so much of this really is building upon what we've gained from gleaning traditional knowledge from the indigenous people throughout the range of ash. So you can advance, Amanda. So again, just to reaffirm, many on this webinar and certainly are both either directly tied to the cultural significance of black ash or are certainly well aware of the significance of this species. But when we think about invasive insects and diseases, oftentimes we're talking about ecosystem impacts and the impacts on a commercially important tree species. But really, you can't undersell just the significance of this threat as it relates to the cultures of indigenous people throughout the range of black ash. And so on the right-hand side, I just have a range map of black ash or brown ash for my friends from Maine that are on the call. And so anywhere that range intersects with ancestral lands, really there are traditions built around basket making, both from a functional standpoint. And so the picture in the lower portion of the slide, you can see some large baskets used for potatoes from Richard Silboy and the Rustic Micmac. The basket in the middle there is actually representing a wedding basket to basically commemorate weddings with the Akwesasne people. And so not only is it an important material for cultural lifeways, but really most of the traditions associated with people that intersect with this range have an element of ash tied to them. And so as we think about what we can learn about the species and kind of how we can conserve that species in the landscape, beginning with the traditional knowledge is really a critical step. So you can advance, Amanda. So what's different about dealing with black ash relative to many other tree species is that there's so little Western science known about it, despite it being a pretty prevalent species across the landscape. And so really there's some amazing resources that have been developed over the years to try to understand what is the traditional knowledge that exists as it relates to both the ecology of black ash, as well as kind of how does it play into the cultural lifeways of tribes in the region. And so many might be familiar with some of the work that was done by Alara Diamond and Marla Emery, but they spent some time actually interviewing artisanal basket makers throughout the Northeast, primarily in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and asking about what sites actually were most suitable for producing basket grade ash. And this quote on the left-hand side really kind of summarizes what one of the basket makers and others have spoken to through at least our experiences of looking at ash in the landscape, and that not every black ash makes a good tree for producing splints for baskets. Those familiar, and again, likely some on this call produce baskets themselves, recognize we often want wider rings, particularly for those kind of larger, coarser baskets, but also occasionally narrow rings for those more fine artisanal baskets. But in general, kind of trees that are growing at a bit faster rate than on average are ideal basket trees. And so the picture on the left-hand side shows kind of two different bark textures. They're both black ash. And on the left, that's kind of what we're looking for, kind of that flakier bark showing a tree that's growing faster in a landscape. And so from experience and kind of interviews that Alaire and Marla Emery conducted, really they pointed out that it's really these trees that are growing on these sites that have some moisture, but are not actually highly saturated sites. And so just to reaffirm this with lots of data, we did some work looking at kind of the range of responses in black ash in terms of growth rate. And the slide on the right-hand side basically is just showing, depending on the level of waterlogging stress, so the upper panel kind of corresponds to basically an upland forest where black ash is growing, and then the bottom panel corresponds to kind of a hydric, kind of a flat basin wetland that black ash is growing in. Within those ecosystems, really, you know, when we're in a very wet environment, black ash grows fairly well regardless of the level of competition around it, really speaking to just how competitive it is on these sites. But in these upland environments, you can actually get really high rates of black ash growth, particularly when it's in a low competition environment. And so for many, many centuries and millennia, you know, traditional basket makers have already been gathering these trees that we've just proven grow a lot faster when they're in the uplands and also have a lower level of competition. All right, Amanda, you can advance that. And I apologize, I can't point to that. I don't think I can point, so I'm just gonna have to walk you through my images here. So just to kind of put some context on black ash, and at least where my intersection with working on emerald ash borer really began. When I was working in Minnesota, emerald ash borer was found in St. Paul in 2009. And what this map is depicting, as much as we certainly think a lot about black ash or brown ash in the Northeast, if you look at FIA data, and this is a map that Nate Siegert produced of just the density of black ash trees at the county level across the US, you can see fairly clearly that the highest concentration of black ash dominated forests are in the lake states, and in particular, thanks Amanda, in north central Minnesota. And so when emerald ash borer was first detected in this part of the country, one of the biggest concerns was certainly about how it was going to affect the green ash in the urban areas and white ash in these mixed stands. But really a lot of the focus went to how do we deal with these areas that have a really, really strong black ash component in terms of dominance on the landscape. And so so one of the things that we first were trying to understand were how do these forests operate, you know, with this really strong dominance of black ash. Ironically, you know, despite there being, you know, tremendous amount of traditional knowledge about these areas, there really had not been a lot studied about them in terms of just what their natural dynamics are and how these ecosystems persist. And so from a perspective of understanding how the selective removal of a tree species might impact the system, one of the elements we wanted to know was just how do these forests operate from a disturbance dynamic standpoint. And so the graph that you're seeing is a reconstruction of the age structure for an old growth black ash swamp. So again, those that haven't ever really looked at data from a strongly black ash dominated forest, you know, we're talking over 300 stems right here, and you can see the black bars representing kind of mostly black ash. And what we tended to see were two things. One, black ash lives for an extremely long period of time on these sites. And so this population that we were looking at had some trees that dated to 310 years old. So really speaking to just the adaptation of black ash to dominate these wet environments. But what I think was more important is that what we see, if this continuous recruitment of black ash over time, as you can see, these bars are really occurring in every decade, representing kind of individuals from that species establishing, really highlighting just the ability of this species to dominate these sites. And more importantly, that when we're seeing recruitment, so new cohorts establishing in the forest, it's happening with a canopy present. We're not seeing evidence of a giant stand replacing disturbance, whether it be wind or fire, that results in a pulse of a single cohort of trees. We're seeing this fine scale dynamic. You can advance this slide, Amanda. So the reason that's important is that these ecosystems, especially these large basin wetland black ash systems, so we have very few examples of that here in New England and the Northeast, but these are quite common, these large glacial basins in the lake states. What we'll see over time is that there's a strong foundational role of black ash in these systems. That is, there's tremendous control over ecosystem properties that's exerted by the black ash, just given how dominant it is, as well as given the unique traits it has in terms of its ability to use water, its litter quality, and so forth. And so what this graph is just demonstrating is kind of the growing season through the lens of water table depth in a black ash swamp. And so we really wanted to understand kind of how does black ash control water table dynamics in these ecosystems. And so beginning kind of at the beginning of the growing season, this is northern Minnesota, so that tends to be mid-May. What you can generally see is I have the groundwater height on the y-axis there, and anything negative is that you won't be seeing water above ground. And so early in the growing season, those that have spent time in these ash swamps know you can see water at the water surface, and often that will persist for an extended period of time. Once black ash and other species start to leaf out, we start seeing kind of this slow progressive drawdown of that water table that only gets kind of bounced back up with some sort of rainfall events. But what's really critical is that when we have an intact black ash canopy on these ecosystems, their ability to kind of buffer and modulate any of these pulsy rainfall events is pretty impressive. And so black ash really keeps that water table, at least to our eyes, fairly stable over time by just kind of using water as the season goes on. So a lot of the concern as we think about emerald ash borer impacts in these ecosystems, particularly these large basin ecosystems, is just what would that mean in terms of regional water table dynamics and certainly the prevalence of more kind of obligate wetland species as these areas got wetter and wetter. All right, Amanda, you can advance. The other aspect of black ash, and this is also true for green ash and white ash, and I'll mention white ash a bit in a moment in this context, is that relative to the majority of the other tree species and more broadly the other vegetation that exists in these black ash swamps, the litter quality of black ash is actually quite high. And so because of that, it's really important to both the productivity of tadpole communities, but even more broadly, it really has a major influence on what we see in terms of food web and trophic dynamics in these ecosystems. So the figure on the right is some work that Melissa Youngquist, who is a postdoc with myself, and Brian Palick, who's led a lot of work on black ash as well in the Lake States, where Melissa actually fed caddisfly larvae different litter quality and looked at kind of the rate of decomposition of that litter depending on the caddisfly activity. And what we generally saw was that caddisfly that were fed black ash litter really had a much higher survival probability than any other kind of litter type. And really we used litter that was also found in that ecosystem. And so again, speaking just to that unique role that black ash plays, not only from a cultural perspective in these areas, but also the unique ecosystem dynamics associated with that species. All right, you can advance, Amanda. So moving to kind of the other ash species, and I apologize to green and pumpkin ash, we're not going to talk much about that today, but moving on to the other ash species that is really critical in terms of as we think about our activities in the landscape, and certainly where a lot of Amanda and my worlds have intersected. This map on the left is showing white ash importance values, so just a relative abundance of white ash based on forest inventory analysis data. So as opposed to the black ash situation where we would have entire ecosystems in places dominated by a single species or the majority of that area dominated by black ash, white ash is a bit of a different scenario where we start seeing, instead of it being dominant, although it can be fairly dominant on some old field sites, it's more of an important component. And what's different about white ash relative to black ash is that it's a species that has commercially been of interest and commercially harvested for a long time. And so, white ash is something that frequently we're intersecting with on our day-to-day management activities. And so it's one in which when we think about emerald ash borer impact from a traditional kind of commercial product standpoint, there's certainly some concern over what that might mean. And also certainly some behavior that could be motivated by the threat of a high value species. So you can advance, Amanda. So because of its high economic value and the fact that it's kind of a part of forests that are managed quite often, a lot of what we've done in terms of building an understanding of white ash has been less about creating new studies to understand how white ash functions, but more importantly, kind of digging into what do we already know and trying to get a better understanding of how has this species actually been able to persist and be a significant component of our northern forests relative to kind of what we know in terms of the sylvics and just the overall dynamics of these systems. And so what's often quite striking about white ash is that it's a species that we frequently encounter mixed with things like sugar maple beech on fairly mesic sites. And so we have a species, white ash, which is actually rated as mid-tolerant, but really behaves much more like an intolerant tree species, very often kind of being a part of the ecosystem surrounded by tree species that really can outcompete it in the shade. And so one of the things that we've really tried to emphasize a bit about the ecological role of white ash is that it's a species that really is a gap obligate. When we see white ash in the canopy, we know there was a large disturbance there and because of its ability to grow quite rapidly, can be quite important. What's also kind of fun for old time's sake is Dave Orwig is on this webinar, and he took this picture of me coring a big white ash a long time ago out in the Berkshires in a very rich site, but notice it's surrounded by beach, and so we have a species that clearly was able to recruit and do quite well on that site. And so when we think about the impact of emerald ash borer on these ecosystems, so much more diffuse disturbance, killing scattered trees, what folks have found, particularly Wendy Klooster's group looking at this in mixed forests in places like Ohio and Michigan, that when we lose that ash component from the overstory, because of its inability to compete in the shade, it really does not maintain itself on these sites after EAB. You can advance now, Amanda. Just to kind of reiterate again, none of us want to eat leaf litter, but if we did, ash would be one that we would volunteer for over others. So just like white ash, just like black ash, white ash is a species again, based on the work that's been done by folks like Gary Lovett and others looking at litter quality of different northeastern tree species. It really is kind of the second highest litter quality in the uplands relative to basswood. And so because of that, even in an ecosystem that might be dominated largely by beech litter, so really kind of poor quality litter, so you can get a very deep leaf layer, in pockets where you have dominance by white ash, you'll really find a much thinner leaf litter layer, which really reflects the rapid cycling of that litter. And what that often does is reinforce things like getting recruitment of species like sugar maple and ash beneath those areas, and also allowing for kind of support of much richer species that can do well on the site. Likewise, those of us that have looked at ash for a long time, the challenge of emerald ash borer is that ash often looks pretty poor to begin with, because it often is the last tree to leaf out and then often the first tree to drop its leaves. That's just its natural phenology, and what that does is really create a unique environment beneath ash. And so thinking a bit about how that might change over time. And then finally, as I mentioned in the previous slide, being a gap obligate species, white ash really can grow at tremendous rates of growth. And so when we look at regional inventory data, besides white pine, white ash really is a disproportionate amount of our large tree component in forests. And so thinking about both that from a carbon perspective, but more importantly, in terms of a large tree habitat standpoint, losing white ash and losing that component is quite important and could have major impacts on how we think about those systems. All right, Amanda, you can advance. So when we think about dealing with these invasive insects and diseases or climate change or anything that has a lot of uncertainty associated with it, and really anything that pushes kind of our own knowing about the system and really what we've known based on traditional experience, there's often this desire to really rush out and figure out like, what is the solution to this new pressing threat? And the challenge with a lot of what we're seeing now, and again, this group is well aware of it, and it's kind of your central point of emphasis, with many of these novel invasions, whether it's introduced insects and diseases or plants, the urgency of that threat is always going to outpace our science, kind of our ability to come up with some silver bullet solution that's fully grounded in decades worth of science. And so when we're trying to address these threats and really deal with like what is a logical adaptation strategy, really a key element, and something I've been really fortunate to spend a lot of time with Amanda doing is can we build a community of practice? Can we build from our collective experiences, both traditional experiences, and this is a picture of Les Benedict from one of our ash workshops that Amanda will talk about a little bit later, but also from our experience from a management community perspective, and also our scientific expertise. And so bringing many voices together as opposed to just going into our own silos and coming up with a solution. And so I'm going to go over just some context here for kind of the history of how we've been approaching addressing emerald ash borer from a community of practice standpoint. And then Amanda's going to talk a bit more about some of the opportunities that she's been a part of, and certainly has been a catalyst for here in the Northeast. And so I'm going to start again, bringing us back to the lake states, and just to provide a little bit of a history, and this certainly extends as well throughout, again, the range of black ash, relative to how we were approaching these forests and this species prior to emerald ash borer, once emerald ash borer showed up, and then how we thought about it going forward. And so the pre-emerald ash borer period, both from time immemorial, so certainly the traditional uses of this by tribes throughout the range, was one of sustaining that resource, harvesting that resource for your own traditional uses, but really doing it in a way that sustains the species in the landscape. Even from the perspective of traditional managers in the lake states, I have a scan of Gus Erdman's classic 1987 Black Ash Management Handbook. And if you read the final punchline of that handbook, it says, if you're going to manage a black ash forest, manage it for black ash, which is certainly not very satisfying as we think about trying to diversify these areas and deal with the emerald ash borer threat. And then more broadly, many times folks would just stay away from these areas from a commercial forestry standpoint because they're wet and hard to operate in. And so really prior to EAB, it was either traditional uses that were kind of sustaining a very important cultural material or occasional management, largely just to perpetuate the species that really was meant to dominate these sites. What's interesting, and certainly we've seen this time and time again, is that once emerald ash borer arrived, and so certainly it was detected in the early 2000s, but a lot of the work that Nate Siegert and others have done has really shown it was here since the mid-90s at least. Once that insect arrived, really it shifted from either ignoring black ash forests or sustaining them to all of a sudden really what can we do to manage the threat, and how do we actually targetedly do things to the forest that may or may not influence the behavior of emerald ash borer. And so I tend to call this time period the phloem reduction era. And those that were familiar with phloem reduction, really the idea was that if you preemptively go out and harvest the largest diameter ash in a stand, really the notion is that given that phloem area is really expansive, it can support a lot of larvae, taking those large trees out will have a disproportionate impact on the emerald ash borer and the ability for eruptive kind of outbreak behavior to occur. And this recommendation really was meant and is meant still for when you're proximate to an outbreak, really trying to contain a VA-based spread. But what really happened, unfortunately, during that time period is this recommendation got propagated out onto the landscape as this is how you should be managing ash forests. And really, you should preemptively be cutting out these big trees as a way to deal with that. And we'll certainly talk a bit about more of that in a second. So a key kind of data point in this history is in 2010, and I have a picture in the top right-hand corner there, and that's Mike Benedict, the other half of the Benedict duo, who at the time was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he and Jana Albers, who's Minnesota DNR Forest Health Specialist, and Gary Swanson, a silviculturist in the Chippewa National Forest, all convened a group of scientists and managers and forest health specialists to really talk about black ash, both understand that species, but more importantly, talk a bit more about like how do we really tackle this issue. And really that was an important kind of watershed moment in terms of how folks started to think a bit more about this holistically and trying to find ways not just to manage the insect, but can we actually manage for resilient forests. And so, really shifting that focus to, are there ways for us to diversify these ecosystems, modify our harvesting behavior in a way that will actually sustain the resource as opposed to just kind of discriminately remove a host species across the landscape. All right, Amanda, you can advance. So the history for white ash is a little bit different. And in the Northeast, typically I'm not a fan of being in last place when it comes to my sports teams. But when it comes to invasive insects and invasions, here in the Northeast, and I pick on Vermont just because that's where I'm rooted these days, we're way in the back of the pack in terms of when EAB has been discovered. And so just to put the timeline on there again, detection was 2002 in Michigan. It was February 2018 when emerald ash borer was found in Vermont, after many years of being surrounded by states in a province with it in there. And so over 30 states now have emerald ash borer in it. 6 provinces have emerald ash borer in it. And so one of the advantages of being towards the back of the pack is there's a tremendous body of knowledge that's been developed, both from a forest health protection standpoint, but also some mistakes to be learned from in terms of how we were approaching kind of the threat versus kind of managing the ecosystem. And so very shortly after that February 2018 infestation, the state of Vermont really deserves a lot of credit for developing this ash management guidance for forest managers that really took a much more ecosystem-centric focus on that and really thought through some of those challenges and how to work in the landscape. And I have a picture both of Dan Kilborn measuring a large white ash, and actually Carbo, who's on the call as well, on his woodlot, thinking a bit through how do we kind of sustain this resource on the landscape. So Amanda, you can advance. So before I pass it over to Amanda, really one of the main challenges that's a bit different than the brown ash scenario or black ash scenario is that we're now talking about a minor component of a very mixed forest. And we could just allow emerald ash borer to come through and eliminate the species, and that certainly is going to happen in many cases. But one of the main discussions that really changed when it was discovered in Vermont was how do we actually manage the forest in a way that keeps white ash as part of the mix. And so this nice white ash you can see in the picture there, if there's, the markets are strong for that tree, maybe I'm going to want to harvest that tree. And so if I harvest that tree, how do I do it in a way that not only certainly is good for the ecosystem overall, but also is actually keeping ash out there and trying to leave some future options for at least hopefully some either natural resistance in the population, or over time, finding integrated pest management strategies that can sustain the species. And so much of where I guess our worlds have collided in terms of Amanda and I getting to know each other is around this argument. How do we keep ash as part of the forest, and how do we do that in a way that both is consistent with our values from a forest management perspective, but also certainly acknowledging kind of the ecosystems that we're working in. So Amanda, I'll switch to you for that stuff.
All right, thanks, Tony. Yeah, so picking up where Tony left off in Vermont, how do we make, how do we actually make an impact and turn that body of knowledge into practice? So there was a lot of activity in Vermont in 2019. I know there's been a lot of activity around the country as emerald ash borer has come and gone in waves, but we're highlighting what's been happening in Vermont because it's perhaps most relevant to the direction that we're taking today and hopefully into the future. So in 2019, in May, there was a key meeting and up in the islands looking at the preservation of cultural keystone species. So really focusing on ash and black ash management in particular. Bringing folks together from tribes and also from the scientist community, sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, and trying to keep some ideas going for how can you sustain black ash as a component of an ecosystem. In June and July, the Forest Stewards Guild got to partner with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation and with Tony and with the Vermont Land Trust on putting together a couple of forums. And these are geared toward foresters that are seeking licensing credits, but it's an opportunity to get together and try to answer that question. How do you manage ash in a stand that's a diverse northern hardwood species mix, but how do you manage the ecosystem and maintaining ash, knowing that EAB is somewhere on the horizon? And again, we're hoping the answer is not cut at all, because we're trying to look at the ecosystem as a whole. So in these forums, we were able to bring in a really great suite of experts in science and practice, and looking at the economics also in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we went out in the field and got folks together and broke them into consulting groups and gave them a scenario, based on the stand that we were in, and had folks use the knowledge that they gained in the morning to try to come up with a prescription for the afternoon. So spoiler alert, in all the different groups that we had with different expertises from around Vermont and a few other places, most folks came down to essentially the same silvicultural prescription to try to maintain ash in the stand, which was pretty gratifying. Folks are interested in kind of small group selection, while tending the matrix, trying to retain some of these taller, older, stronger seed-producing ash, and paying attention to female ash where you could identify them, and making sure you maintain those species in the mix. I'll talk about some additional recommendations that have come out of that in a little bit. But again, in terms of building a community of practice, having these forums, indoor and outdoor, to kind of share knowledge was really valuable. In December, we also followed up at the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperatives Conference with a listening session. And at that meeting, we had some folks that had come to the forums, but there were a lot of folks that were from different audiences that work with landowners, or that some of you on the call might have been there. Folks that just work with different audiences and might have had a different level of awareness of ash and of how you can manage it in ways other than cutting it before the bug gets it. So we did kind of a listening session and tried to get a sense of where folks were coming from in their understanding of how they make decisions about managing ash. So that's just activities that have been happening in Vermont in last year, and we've been trying to keep the momentum going with that. Vermont is not the first state to think about ash. In Maine, we're very blessed to have a strong tribal presence that's been building a community around ash, thinking about black ash for years. I think the first, John Daigle had shared an article with me. Some of the earliest conversations happened in the early 2000s when they heard on the horizon about this threat of climate change and about this little green bug over in the lake state. So conversations began happening then. A somewhat more recent highlight was this 2014 Black Ash Symposium hosted by the University of Maine on sharing traditional and scientific knowledge. So once again, building a community by sharing that scientist and manager partnership, bringing folks together that have the inwards experience that are backed up by all the cool graphs that Tony's been sharing. So again, with the goal of sustaining black ash in the landscape to maintain that tribal value. Most recently, you can see a few of the folks in this Zoom call. There's a kind of an informal black ash task force group led or convened by John Daigle and other folks at the University of Maine. So within Maine, and of course, folks from other states are welcome. But this group met over the summer and has been having periodic meetings to basically share information, just keep everybody in touch with what's happening in the science, what's happening on the landscape, what have forest health specialists been finding, what new research has been out there, what management guides are out there. Just trying to keep folks in touch with what's the latest information that can be shared and how do we get that out on the ground. I'll touch on another component in just a moment. So I mentioned with the Vermont forums some ideas that have come out of that, and just since 2019, there's been some kind of a fresh look at how you can manage ash, manage a forest with ash, knowing that there's a little green bug, but not making that the focus of what you do. So in July, in one of the concluding webinars for a series offered by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in collaboration with the Forest Stewards Guild, we developed 10 recommendations for managing ash. And I have the hyperlink, I'll drop them into the chat box later, but it's also available on the Forest Stewards Guild website and on the NIAC's website, forestadaptation.org. And you can look through the webinar series. There's a lot of great info in there. But these 10 recommendations are kind of distilled down from what we heard in the forum and also heard in a whole variety of science that's been coming out in more recent years, that is sort of since the era of form reduction, when we're now looking at managing for a resilient ecosystem that includes maintaining a strong component of ash. So I'll let you take a moment and read through some of these. And again, I encourage you to download and take a longer look at the 10 recommendations document. So these are some key tips on what you can do in managing a stand that includes ash that can help maintain it as part of your ecosystem into the future. And I wanted to highlight a couple of these in particular. So again, building from collective experiences and from the science, one of those key components is manage the forest, not the insect. So again, in this era, since time immemorial, the system had been maintained with people as part of it. And then just in the last 20 years, the little green bug has been really wreaking havoc on the system. So when we want to solve the problem, it's really a system problem, not just the insect. So we're encouraging folks to manage the forest, look for resiliency and grow resiliency in your forest. Don't just look at the little green bug. Another one of the points we didn't highlight is that there's hope and resistance. So there is resistance that has been shown in some ash trees. It's not like all of them die completely. It's not always pretty, but it's not a complete wipeout. So if you do have some ash in your stand that are looking healthy, that are looking promising, looking like they could they're growing, they can be good seed producers, then it's worth keeping them, because there is resistance out there, and you don't want to take American chestnut. You don't want to wipe out every last tree just because of a forest health threat. And you want to keep future options, including future ash. So as foresters, we still like to think about regeneration. So if you have these opportunities to grow not only standing existing saw logs into tall, healthy canopy trees, but you want to think about the regeneration. You want to think about where appropriate on the landscape, put in those groups, get that sunlight in, and give the future ash a little bit of an edge, so it can take over and hopefully you can have a future forest to look at and to work with. Also, when it comes to to individual trees, and especially where humans in our more urban communities really intersect with ash and EAB and the forest, IPM, integrated pest management efforts, have been showing some promise. So in certain locations, IPM can definitely help protect specific individual trees. So there's more information out there than we have time to talk about in our webinar. But we wanted to share that IPM is another potential solution to this problem when it's applied in the right places. So we have some take-home thoughts. I know that we've shared a lot of information here. So first and foremost, in order to address an issue such as emerald ash borer in the forest, you need to build both knowledge, the scientific knowledge such as Tony shared, and you need to build the community. Community really means communication. So you have to be able, as I said in the beginning, you have to be able to speak forester, you have to be able to speak scientist, you have to be able to speak to woodland owners. You know, if you can't explain it to your 8-year-old kid, you know, then how is someone going to be able to understand and go out and take an action that you want them to do? So you have to be able to speak, and you have to be able to listen to all the audiences. I think there's a lot more listening that we could do to people who have traditional knowledge that has unfortunately been ignored or left behind or buried for a very long time. There's a lot more listening that we can do to each other to try to learn from diverse perspectives and try to build a community that can sustain the forest and sustain that strong component of ash that we all want to see. So you have to address the human component. We really don't encourage focusing on the organism. It's really the ecosystem that is broken, and it's the ecosystem that needs to be repaired. So when you want people to take action, we suggest framing those actions in the context of what your community members know. So tell a story, encourage people to get to know their trees, get to know the history of that species, and understand it from a different context. So understand, you know, where your community members are coming from, especially people from diverse perspectives that you might not be familiar with. Really make an effort to understand where they're coming from and work together, scientists and managers, all sorts of audiences. Make sure you're working together to try to find those solutions. And with that, we have a whole lot of thank yous. So I'll let you read all the thank yous of all the logos of agencies and organizations that have supported us in trying to help get these ideas out there. And with that, I think, Tony, do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, I just, you know, again, want to thank Amanda for doing this. And this community really is something that, you know, she's been tremendous at bringing together across to stakeholders and getting us out there and understanding different ways of knowing as it relates to this issue. And so I just want to acknowledge her for agreeing to do this and kind of all that she's catalyzed in the region. But kind of more broadly, you know, I think, you know, so much of what this story is learning from the past, both traditionally, but also you know, reevaluating kind of what we know about a given species and how it fits into an ecosystem. Even if there's a new novel threat out there in the landscape, it's still a northern hardwood forest with an ash component. How do we work with that versus treating it like a foreign object, given there's now a introduced insect in the mix?
All right, thank you. So I'm sure there's questions in the chat box. Audrey, do you want to pick those up?
Yeah. So first, you know, thank you so much. If people want to give a little hand clapping, that's awesome. Yeah, so yeah, we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And there are a couple of questions that popped up through the talk. One from Kristen is, I think, more for Tony, but either of you. Near the beginning of the talk, you showed a range map for black ash. And the question is that just the range of black ash, or does kind of the culturally significant to indigenous groups range overlap with that black ash range? You know, do they overlap a lot, or is there black ash places where people haven't used it traditionally? No,
they certainly do. And I think what's interesting is someone that grew up in the Northeast and went to Maine and was really exposed to the Penobscot people and their connection to black ash as a basket making material. When I moved to the Lake States, it was kind of similar. People telling me like, well, don't you know this is used for baskets? Like, so yeah, you know, really throughout the range, whether it's a, you know, the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe or, you know, the Penobscot people. I mean, it's really culturally significant throughout that range from my own experience and certainly some of the work that others have done with the species. But, you know, just in terms of regional significance, the creation story of the Wabanaki people comes from the black ash. And so there's certainly depending on the level of cultural significance. In some cases it's more of a cultural lifeway, in others it is tied more directly both to not only cultural lifeways, but the cultural traditions of the people. But everywhere I've worked that's intersected with that range has had some direct connection. And then folks that are familiar with, Cherokee people and the use of white oak and other species for basket. So the basket making tradition extends across various species, but black ash really is the one that is so important in our tribes.
Thanks. Another question that popped up while you were showing the hydrology over the season, just curious about, is there some threshold that you have to see with a certain amount of black ash abundance before it exerts this sort of hydrological control?
So it's less a threshold and more kind of a hydrogeomorphic setting. And so these are kind of large basin wetlands. So we looked at black ash dominated wetlands in different settings. So one being more transitional. So from upland to lowland, those would be the places where you might have the most basket grade ash. And then those that are more depressional, so kind of small, like think of like a forested vernal pool, and then these basins. And so in both those depressional wetlands and the basins, you tend to see kind of a stronger control, or at least a stronger coupling between what you're getting for rainfall and what you're getting for snow melt and hydrology. But in those more transitional ones, as you would expect, that's being driven more by kind of regional water flows. And so there's less of even if it's ash dominated, it seems less tied to the ash is doing other important functions, but you're not seeing like this perfect coupling between water use and the amount of flooding on that site. So it's really in these more kind of basin, kind of flat, large wetland complexes.
Cool. Okay. So audience, are there other questions that people have? I have one.
Well,
oh yeah, go ahead, Amanda. Yeah, please.
Oh, I was going to add. I meant to add earlier that we've been reached out to by the group that John Daigle is convening in Maine about how do we get these 10 recommendations for managing ash into the hands of landowners who don't have the same forestry knowledge that a forester might. So we're going to be talking with folks pretty soon, and Tony and I have been getting emails from our colleagues in Vermont as well that have an interest in trying to get that information out to landowners as well, because it takes foresters, landowners, loggers that are working together to manage the forest and make the decisions about what trees stay and what trees will be there in the future.
For sure. Yeah. So maybe we'll stop screen sharing unless so that we can interact with the audience a little more. We can go back to it if we need to refer back to the slide. Thanks. So let's see, there's a question from Tyler wondering, would you find it important to prioritize the stands with the HGM settings, I'm not sure what that is, that allow for ash to control the water table? I think this is a follow-up. Yeah, do you want to prioritize stands that allow for ash to control the water table when you're managing to increase resiliency?
Yeah, that's kind of been the general approach. Obviously, like any of these more resource intensive strategies, whether it's protecting trees or in the case of the lake states, a lot of the work's been more just diversifying those stands, so trying to get other species established. And so you can't do that everywhere. And you can only drown so many seedlings in an ash swamp, which we've done plenty of in these studies. So they focus more on those that have kind of they're wetter, they have the potential for kind of greater impact if you were to lose ash from them. That's the unfortunate part. Is some of these wetter sites really tend to be just purely black ash. And so it's hard to get most of the tree species growing out there. What they have tried are things like silver maple, swamp white oak, hackberry, and actually balsam poplar as well in some of those areas. But swamp white oak seems to be the one that's doing best in some of those initial kind of resilience and restoration type approaches. But yeah, definitely prioritizing those that might have the largest ecosystem change if we lose ash.
Yeah, great. So there is a question wondering about indigenous methods to manage black ash. Are there good resources for that, or people that you would recommend learning from?
Yeah, and I mentioned Amanda, Les Benedict gave an amazing presentation, and again, there's many on that call that know Les and also know many traditional methods beyond what he speaks to, but I talked a bit about traditional ways of both evaluating trees, further basket making potential, which often included cutting a notch to see the ring width. And so part of that management is if that tree does not show the ring widths that are suitable for basket making, that tree gets left in the forest with a notch on it. Now that future folks gathering for baskets can see and will not do this, cut that tree down. And so it's kind of sustaining that resource in the landscape. But I don't know, I mean, there were some videos that were shown as part of that. I know the Akwesasne Mohawk has some pretty awesome videos that they put together over time related to that. And I'm sure similar resources exist for the Penobscot and others. But I don't know, Amanda, do you know of any written or recorded?
Well, I would just add, Tyler, who is on this call, has put out an inventory field manual. So understanding where you can find ash, how do you inventory the quality. Tyler, I haven't gotten to read it cover to cover. I'm sorry, but there are people that know more about this than Tony and I do. So I'd be happy to share the floor if people want to share a response.
Absolutely, Tyler, or if there's anyone else who practices indigenous management of ash, speak up.
And it might be a good future webinar too.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we can certainly, if anyone wants to chat in perspectives, that's super helpful as well. We can loop back to that question or call as well, but we have a question from Dave Orwig, curious about what are some effective ways to increase the diversity of audiences to listen to and learn from?
Yeah, I could take this one. So I think some of it is just connecting with people who know people and being humble and being willing to put yourself out there and make mistakes and learn. I feel like I'm a student of life, so I'm always asking people when I meet someone who knows something that I don't know about. I'll ask them questions, and I'm always eager to learn from them. I've been fortunate in my role with the Guild to get to learn a lot from a lot of really smart people, just by asking questions and getting out there and making connections with folks. I learned from land trusts that are involved in controlling invasive species. Like here in Maine, we have the Maine Invasive Species Network. So I learned from people that have started a community effort to get rid of invasive poison ivy and other really problematic plants at like the Portland headlight. And I learned from scientists at the University of Maine that are studying carbon. And how that affects, carbon management in forests affects climate change. So a lot of it is just kind of making the connections. And what I get to do, fortunately, in my job is creating, learning events. So bringing people together, like in the forums that we put together last summer, to get people together, learning from each other, getting the experts in the room together, and folks that we want to learn. Everybody has something to learn from each other. I think that there's no single person that has all the answers. So just reaching out to people that people that know people that and trying to create the space to get all together. I'm glad we're able to have this webinar today, but definitely we all prefer being in the field. When you're kicking the same dirt and looking at the same trees and working together on the same issue, it's a lot easier to get to the answers that we're looking for.
Definitely. It takes a lot of work too, so I really admire what you're doing. Okay, another question about biocontrol in particular, like where can it work? And are there any indigenous perspectives related to biocontrol that you're aware of?
So I can't speak to indigenous perspectives of biocontrol, not being tribal tribal member. But I can share that on the calls that John Daigle and others were part of in Maine, that the Maine Forest Service just shared current biocontrol efforts. So it's in the mix as a potential solution. Again, I don't think that there's a silver bullet, but we're always interested in what's coming out there, and how can we try to get the right controls in the right places without further upsetting the balance of the ecosystem, to try to sustain black ash and white ash where we'd like to have them maintained in the forest.
And I think one thing that has been shown, at least some of the work in Michigan, that the biocontrols that have the most promise seem to be really effective at keeping the larvae densities low on smaller ash. And so, again, this notion of trying to regenerate and have a diversity of age classes in the landscape of the species, I think, are pretty critical in that context. And I think what was very informative for a lot of us that were part of that 2019 cultural keystone species colloquium, and John Daigle and Tyler were there. There was a lot of discussion from Deb McCullough, who did awesome work about, like, let's just preserve ash with emamectin benzoate. It works, and we can do it in different places. And from at least a cultural reaction from the tribes in that context was that making splints and putting those in your mouth from a tree that's been soaked in insecticide for many decades to preserve it was not really a reasonable solution, or one that was literally palatable. So I think, the idea then was, like, how do we preserve splints as opposed to preserving the tree on the stump in the woods? And so I think the question is an important one in terms of just the acceptability of what might be very effective at keeping a tree living, but does it really preserve that cultural material in a way that's suitable?
Well, awesome. Yeah, so I think we'll wrap up here, and I really appreciate everyone who came today. It was a great turnout, and thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you so much, Tony, for taking some time to share the community building and technical work that you're doing and continuing to do. So I'm inspired to go out and think about ash forests in a little different way. Thanks.
Thank you. And we encourage people to connect with our community, connect with your community about ash. We hope to keep that in the forest with or without that stupid little green bug.